Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christian Burris, and I am the co-chair of the ZSR Library Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event. If any of you are of a certain age, you might remember the Transformers being more than meets the eye, but today we have with us Mr. David Davis, the Associate Director of Landscaping Services here at Wake Forest, to talk about the campus landscape being more than meets the eye. A few words about Mr. Davis. He has his Bachelor of Science degree in Landscape Horticulture from North Carolina State University. He is a member of the Professional Grounds Management Society, a certified grounds manager, a North Carolina Department of Agriculture licensed pesticides applicator, and over 30 years of experience in the field, with 23 of those years, am I correct there, being at Wake Forest University, where he's been employed since May 13th, 1991. Just got that fact a few minutes ago. He's also an Eagle Scout and an avid gardener and outdoorsman with a lifetime of observing in the field. So, ladies and gentlemen, a man with a finger or maybe a green thumb on the pulse of this campus, Mr. David Davis.
Well, as he said, I'm David Davis. I've been here 23 years. I think when I thought about speaking here, I was actually excited to speak, even though I don't do this often. I think there's some important topics that we'll talk about today, some things that mean something to me, and I think should mean something to you folks. And hopefully, by the end of the day, you'll be encouraged to go out and implement some of these things yourself. And that's the reason I came up with the title I did. I think we all see campuses in this iconic way, and sort of this way we expect to. And with that, we'll just go ahead and start right off. Wake Forest has its iconic quad lawn, and I think we all, that's what we expect to see when we come here. We have our stately trees and our beautiful flower beds. But there's much more than you may realize. There's thoughtful planning and sustainable practices behind what we do in landscaping services. Some of our sustainable practices are reduction and pruning, the tree replacement plan, stormwater BMPs, those are best management practices, invasive plant removal, and the use of native and adaptive plants. In pruning reduction, we're generally talking about removal of high maintenance plants. And you might have noticed some of this going on around campus in the last few years. If you've seen some larger shrubbery, especially some of the older, a few years ago, I know Dr. Weigel here, he probably remembers the large hollies that blocked the view on at the end of Manchester Plaza up near Renolda Hall. Those were extremely high maintenance plants for us. That's not environmentally sound, and it's just one of those things that, even though it's very hard to remove these plants, because people have known to sort of grown to know and love these things, and it's the way it's always been, and there's a certain amount of antiquity there. And you know, plants become sort of like our pets. We hate to see them go. But sometimes we have to make hard decisions, and we look at these things closely. And that's some of what we're talking about. The next phase of that is choosing low maintenance plants. It's the right plant, right place. And more often than not, in most home landscapes, I've probably seen more done wrong than right, and I'm not blaming all you folks. So many times it's landscapers that do it. But it's really imperative when you're thinking about sustainability, and if you're thinking about reducing maintenance, and you're thinking about being able to maybe enjoy your retirement, and maybe to enjoy your summer evenings, maybe to reduce some pruning maintenance. And there again, it's back to choosing the right plants. Now there's some wonderful new cultivars out there in the industry now, dwarf cultivars. That gives us a lot more options than we had several years ago. That's definitely an option. There's a different way of thinking about things, maybe more perennials, more grasses, less shrubs. But those are, that's where we're going when we're talking about reduction and pruning. And by the way, if anybody has any questions at any time, especially with a smaller group like this, it makes sense to me just to stop and feel free. Just get my attention, and we'll see if we can answer your questions. Next is a tree replacement fund, and I don't know if anybody in the room aware of that we have a tree replacement fund? A few years ago, we got involved with a program called Tree Campus USA. One of the things that's expected of, or a requirement of Tree Campus USA, is that we have a tree replacement or tree endowment fund. And the way that works here at Wake Forest, and sometimes there's a little controversy over that, but the way it works is when a building is planned, our arborist goes out and he evaluates the trees on site, and he places a value on the trees, and there are formulas for that. But all the trees over 6 inches in caliper receive a value, and those values are totaled up, and sometimes it's in the thousands of dollars, especially if you've noticed some of the construction on campus in the last few years with the Welcome Center and the new business school, the barn. Those values can be in the thousands of dollars. And the point is not for us to make money. The point is to encourage those pushing for the development, and to encourage architects and engineers to think creatively. If they're thinking creatively and they might realize, yeah, it is worth putting a pencil to this a little bit longer and seeing if we can redesign this building and save that tree, because that's a $5,000 tree. Before they had a value on them, if the only value was the emotional value, there are people that are more interested in development or, quote, progress than trees. So putting a real value on these things made sense. The other way that helps is it actually sets aside money for tree replacement. We simply have money in the bank so that if we were to have a catastrophic event, a tornado, an ice storm, some people not very far south and east of us, Elon got hit really hard recently. So we could be in that situation, you know, in a few moments' time, and we almost were last summer with the June windstorm. So it does set money aside, and the good thing about that, you'll notice we've been putting some fairly nice larger specimens in when we've been doing some replacements. We've been able to go into some of the areas like the barn site and like the Welcome Center site, some of the fringe areas that normally may not get addressed when the landscapes are installed, that may not be budgeted, but we've been able to go back and sort of reestablish some native plantings and really encourage a regrowth of the forest where there were some losses. So it's been a really valuable tool for us in the landscape department. But I guess the message here is campuses taking these things seriously. As much as I hate to see the forest lost, I really do. And I don't know that there's ever, you know, I don't know, and I'm glad I don't have to make the decisions. When is it okay to cut a tree? But at least if we're going to lose trees, we're putting a value on them, and we're getting some money put into a program, a system, a fund, so that we can replace. And this is not a very good slide, but stormwater BMPs, best management practices. I don't know how many of you are aware of these. They're popping up all around campus, but I think sometimes we overlook them and don't realize. On campus, we have 9 biocells. which a biocell is essentially a deep, it's sort of like a well that retains water for a brief period of time, normally 24 hours. They normally have about 2 feet of media, something in the neighborhood of 95% organic matter, 5% sand. They basically absorb stormwater and slowly release it into the ground. They do have overflows. They serve two functions. First, it's stormwater mitigation. It just slows down stormwater. The point of the matter is, though, these work sort of like recycling. Collectively around town, if several people are doing it, or a lot of people are doing it, it really works. And if not many people are, it doesn't work. But it really helps with flash flooding in cities and urban areas. A lot of that is driven by our local stormwater agencies. That's a lot of the reason behind these things occurring. So I'm not going to say that we've done them out of the goodness of our heart, but we've committed to it, and that's part of what we're doing. There are 3 in-ground cisterns. There's one over at Byram. The way these work, they take in several gallons, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, and release them slowly. I think the city county requirements, they have to be released in less than 5 days. So in other words, the water's not there for, that's one of the questions we get. Well, can you reuse that water for irrigation? Well, we'd love to, but we can't hold it long enough. The only way we could hold it long enough is to build more cisterns than what the city county requires. So there's a few hiccups in the system, but they do work. We do have one rain garden at Winston. Some of you folks may be familiar with that. We're going to spend a little time on that. That's one of the more fun projects. We don't have to worry about city county regulations, and it's a little more fun and a little more interesting. We have 3 retention ponds on South Campus near Wingate and Faculty Drive. Those actually serve a purpose. You'll see every so often we remove silt from those ponds, and that's actually what they're meant to do. They're catching sediment before it gets on downstream, so they're serving their purpose well. And there's 28,950 square feet of permeable pavement. The majority of that is at the new business school. There is an extension, and I think maybe we've got a map on that. Here we go. Whoops, let's go back. Here we go. We have permeable pavers here, all the way out, and this is the new business school here in construction. They go down and past Lot W, and then this really wide 30-foot or so walkway here. So we're beginning to put those in. Again, that's a city-county thing. They're regulated. There's certain requirements we have to meet. We do have bioretention cells. There's 5 at the Welcome Center, the rain gardens here at Winston. There are 2 biocells and an in-ground cistern at South Dorm, 3 retention ponds here near Wingate. And then there's 2 biocells at the Golf Center. So those things are popping up all around. And I dare say most people aren't aware. The Winston Hall Rain Garden, from problem area to beautiful asset. This really was a problem area. I'm almost ashamed to say that that's what it looked like before. I will tell you, in being here 23 years, every so often we would have to go in there and remove some soil and add some soil. We were having problems with copper leachate, or copper runoff from the copper roofs. that side of the building didn't have gutters, and when I spoke to the facilities folks about gutters, they said, no, we're not putting gutters. So that answer told me I needed to be creative and come up with a different way of handling things. So this is another photograph of the same thing, and you can see how the turf is dead there, and it's just from copper leachate. But if you'll, again, let's back up. If you'll notice along the building wall, the concrete has this green patina from the copper. And I don't know why it took me so long to figure this out, but eventually, through the internet, I realized that concrete absorbs copper ions. So a light bulb went off, and I realized that we could replace this gravel splash strip with concrete aggregate, which is recycled concrete, which is a pretty nice way of reusing a product. We could replace it with the concrete aggregate, which you see here. And we installed these rain gardens. And this is actually Nancy Fowler. Some of you know her. I didn't get her permission, so maybe you shouldn't tell her. But she actually came out and helped us plant. It was great. We did get a grant to build the rain gardens, so it was almost like we did it for free. We had our labor. So that was a really nice thing. And this is when they're in progress, and you see this media here. A rain garden, the difference in a rain garden and a biocell, there's not very much except for the media is much less shallow. So sometimes we get ponding there. Sometimes water stands for a day or so, sometimes 2 or 3. This is the concrete aggregate all around, and then we built up some nice planting beds. And we decided it being, and this is very early on in the planting, but we decided it being outside of Winston Hall, and that being, it couldn't have been more appropriate, with that being the biology building. We decided this would be a great opportunity to use an all-native planting. We just felt like it lended itself really well to it. Many of those plants handle flooding very well, which occasionally this is flooded. So we proceeded, and this is the first summer, and it's looking great here. There's a whole diversity of plants there. And this is actually maybe a couple of summers later, and it's just a really beautiful, vibrant spot. It's a great teaching opportunity. We've also got it certified as a monarch way station, which is basically a place where monarch butterflies can come and get the food they need to continue their migration south. And if you don't know anything about the monarchs, they're in real decline and in real trouble in the U.S., and it's one of those that we need to help out. And we can help out by having the right plants available for them. So that's one of the things. Although I know this is a relatively small area, we may not make much difference. But if everybody in this room goes and builds a monarch way station and speaks to your neighbors and your friends about monarch way stations, maybe collectively we can make a difference. So,
Can I ask a question
yes,
about
please do.
How much sun does that get? Does that get full sun all day?
You know, surprisingly, that's in the north shadow of the building, and in the winter gets very little. In the summer, it does get midday kind of onward. It gets some hot sun after about 1 p.m., but it's kind of north-northwest, so it's not as sunny as you would think. The nice thing about it is we've been able to utilize that shade for some of the plants that needed a little bit cooler and a little bit more shade. But on the far western, corner, we've been able to get more of the sun plants. But surprisingly, a lot of those are full sun plants, and they look great. You know, they're getting more than 6 hours a day, but it's not like it's all day sun.
Is it possible to get a listing of the native plants that you use there?
Well, I'll tell you what you can do. Feel free to email me. I'm real simple. It's davis@wfu.edu.
Just Davis?
Yep.
Okay.
which I'm surprised. You would think I was the first Davis ever at Wake Forest. I've been here 100 years. I don't know how I managed that, but that's great. There are some really nice websites out there. You can go to the North Carolina Native Plant Society.
I just wondered specifically what
yeah.
you do.
Well, I used a series of different websites and probably all of my years of experience and just some internet search, talking to some local people, sort of a collective bit of research to come up with what we did. This is Trade Scantia in the foreground, the nice blue plant. You normally see those growing in moist locations, riverbanks, stream banks. It's quite moist back there, and they do quite well. There's another plant there, Sweet Spire, and those are commonly available in the landscape trade. The one that you see with the white blooms. You see this kind of frilly white bloom here. Bees love those. Butterflies love those. I think hummingbirds like those. They also have a beautiful fall color, sort of a purple to red. They can colonize and spread by rhizomes, which can be an asset planted in the right place. As a matter of fact, over at Byram, we have a steep hillside on the east side, just above the stream. We occasionally have some gutter overflows, and those gutter overflows were causing problems with the mulch washing away and then causing erosion. So with that, we decided, hey, if we'll take this plant that has a rhizome that tends to hold the soil together, and we'll plant them in this location. So they're working out well there. So you can be creative about how you use plants. One of the things I encourage, and I think it's really important, is being observant and spend some time outdoors. I've got a lifetime outdoors. I love to fish. I've always liked to garden. I love to bow hunt. We canoe some. I grew up in scouting. Paying attention to where and how things grow in nature will make you a much better gardener. And one of the things, and it's funny to me that it's another one of those aha moments. For years, it seemed like in the landscape world, every time we had a water problem, we're like, well, how can we fix this grade, or where can we pipe this water? In the last few years, especially since I've been thinking more about rain gardens and bioretention, I'm more in tune to, well, hey, this is an opportunity. And I dare say I don't know that anyone has a landscape, even a home landscape, where you don't have a few opportunities. Even if it's around your air conditioner unit at home in the summer where the condensate drips out and you have that wet spot, why not make it a mini rain garden? Maybe it's an 8x8 rain garden, but it gives you a whole different opportunity to grow a different group of plants. We'll talk a little bit later about the real need and importance for growing more native plants, but again, it's about opportunity, and anytime you can create opportunity for more diversity, it's a good thing. There's some coneflowers early in the first season. Coneflowers are a great plant that attract goldfinches, and sometimes in great numbers if you have enough coneflowers in a concentration. So I strongly urge planting those in fairly large masses, and let the seeds, let the seed heads stay as long as you can. Don't run right out as soon as they fade and cut them. Let the birds enjoy them, and many butterflies and bees will enjoy those as well. So it's a great plant to have in the landscape. This is the Asclepia tuberosa, or the common butterfly weed. Love those plants, beautiful color, tough as nails. You don't want to fertilize it a lot. They grow native in our fields here. Very hard to transplant from the field, so don't really try that. But they are available now, especially on some websites and that are offering plants for butterfly gardens. A few of the local nurseries sometimes have these in stock. Nice plant. And a really interesting color too in summer. This is an awesome plant called woodland phlox, the most fragrant thing I think I've ever smelled. Really sweet fragrance. They're probably in bloom about right now. We've strategically placed a few of those around the rain garden near some stone benches we have there. I really want to use more of those around campus. These are available at some of the local perennial nurseries. There are some cultivated varieties around, but that's a wonderful, wonderful native plant. They're sort of nondescript, ugly ducklings maybe in the summer. Go dormant in the winter, but in the spring they're absolutely magnificent. Great plant, underutilized. This is cardinal flower in the forefront, the red one. Hummers love it, hummingbirds. Easy to grow as long as you've got lots of water. So if you've got one of those wet spots we're talking about, great plant to introduce. Several different grasses and sedges there. This is a nice little plant called white woods aster. It used to be Aster divardicus. Now I think it's Eurybia divardicus. Really nice plant. Almost grows like a ground cover, beautiful foliage, and then later in the summer it gets covered in these flowers. Works really well tucked in under other plants, grows up to maybe a foot tall. It'll kind of lay over and be just covered in these little star-shaped flowers. It was interesting, I was up in, I'd learned about this plant, and then maybe 3 years ago, I was up at my daughter's graduation in New York City. We went to Central Park, and these things were planted everywhere under some of the trees as a ground cover under trees. So it was nice to see that, and I did a little research. They can take it dry, they can take it moist. I've seen them up on Fisher River in Surrey County growing wild on some land that my family owns. So it's a pretty diverse, widespread plant. Can take some sun, can take some shade. Just a tough little plant, nice plant. A little harder to find. It's a little harder to find, but, and I'm glad you asked local nurseries. You folks as gardeners are what drive local nurseries. Now, we have to encourage more people to ask for the things that they don't carry. And you can't expect an overnight change, but unless we ask for it and unless we encourage it, they won't carry it. It's as simple as that. If the demand is there, their ears start to perk up and they start to think, well, maybe. And I've actually encouraged a few local nurseries, and I'm not advocating anybody here, but I have spoken to a couple of local nurseries right up the road, Schaus Nursery and Ronaldo Nursery both. I encouraged both of them to carry more natives. I encouraged both of them to get involved in the monarch butterfly program. I think both have taken my hints, and I did it somewhat for selfish reasons. I knew that we have resources where we can order wholesale plants, but I don't always need 100 or 1,000 or whatever. Sometimes I need to run and get 3 or 4 plants or 10 plants for a job on campus, and it's nice if we have a local source. So I have really tried to encourage the market, but you folks as consumers, you help drive the market. So encouraging others. Invasive plant removal. Huge problem, more of a problem than I ever could have realized. We as gardeners have been part of the problem. English ivy, for instance, I've personally planted much of that on campus. We discourage its use now. I don't know that we'll ever get rid of it all on campus, and I don't know that I would ever be able to without possibly losing my job. Some people feel strongly about keeping the English ivy. But what we have found is once English ivy starts to climb trees, eventually, this is the immature state of English ivy, by the way. Eventually it will become some woody growth. In mature state, it will actually produce a little berry, a fruit, that birds eat, and they plant it just wherever they be. So you might go into the middle of what you think is an untouched forest somewhere and find English ivy growing, and then once it gets started, it can spread really rapidly. So there is no, it's not controlled. So we feel a certain responsibility as where we can around campus, especially woodland areas, we're starting to remove it. Where it is on campus, that in areas that we can't remove it all at once for various reasons, some of which are financial, some of which are cultural reasons. We're used to it. People like to see it. We are maintaining it such that it can't spread. You know, we keep it in check. But what you have to realize in your home landscapes, you're not going to be there forever. Wake Forest, they'll have somebody that replaces me that'll maintain the ivy. But at your homes, you're not going to be there forever. So really, I would encourage you not to use plants that are invasive. The North Carolina Native Plant Society has a great website with a list of invasive plants. So that's a great place to look. Challenges to invasive plant removal. First, it's costly and it's labor intensive. Many of the invasive plants, they pop up in our woodlands wherever a bird perches and drops a seed. It's extremely labor intensive. And the very name invasive tells you something about it. Usually they're extremely strong. They're tough plants with tough root systems. Many times they're vines like wisteria and bittersweet and different things like that. So they're tough. Many of these plants have herbicide resistance. We can use some of our toughest herbicides, and some of these plants you can't get rid of. So there's a real cost there. Then there's the environmental concerns. Well, can we get rid of it with a herbicide? But if we're going to get rid of it with a herbicide and it's in the middle of a woodland, what are the costs? Or if it's along a stream bank, what are the costs? And there's a very good example there. Along the stream from Lake Catherine down to the bridge there, or the culvert at Renolda Road on Silas Creek, last year we began doing some invasive plant removal. And we had to use a chemical. We couldn't physically remove it without losing all the root systems that were holding the creek banks together. So we did hire a company to use a product that has an aquatic label. In other words, it's labeled for use in and around water. I would say that it does far less damage to the environment than the invasive plants were doing, because they were basically out competing everything else, and probably 95% of the creek bank was covered in invasive plants. And we were at a point where we couldn't do anything, and I knew that if we were going to have a future there that was going to be brighter than what it is today, we had to make a stand. And sometimes that's the stand. Sometimes you have to say, which is the lesser of two evils. And it's not to say that pesticides are evil, but when you start thinking about pesticides in woodlands and creek banks, you know, it scares people. But we're very careful about that, and we use selective herbicides. Our management plan there for the future is we'll start back with native grasses so that we can use a selective herbicide that doesn't injure grasses, but that does injure or kill the invasive broadleaf vines that we had growing there. And we'll use a combination of that and a combination of hand weeding. And over the period of 2 or 3 years, hopefully we'll be to the point that we can fully restore the creek bank and reintroduce some trees and shrubs and some broadleaves. So we have a strategy there. But environmental concerns we talked about, reintroduction. And by this I mean reintroduction of the invasive plant. Well, we may do a great job, but our neighbors don't. And we can't control where the birds fly or where the water washes or where the wind blows. So it's, once invasive plants are in an area, they're always going to be around. So people like me and maybe you as gardeners, we have to be diligent. If we don't keep doing our jobs, well, we'll still have invasives. And the next thing that's a challenge, and I spoke a little bit about it before, is they're a part of the landscape. Sometimes they really are an intrinsic part of the landscape. I mean, some of the ivy on campus, it's part of Wake Forest. You know, some people love to see it, and they kind of gives them that feel of the old campus. So you can't always just go out and rip everything out without some repercussions. Next, native plants. This is probably the most iconic native plant we have in North Carolina is the dogwood. It's our state State flower, lovely tree, wonderful, wonderful plant. And I strongly encourage people to continue to plant them, contrary to some of what you hear about, oh, they have, all these different pests are going to kill them. Well, if we quit planting them, well, you'll see them in the wild still, probably 1,000 years from now, but we need to keep planting. Challenges with using native plants. First is cultural. Again, some people, when they think native plants, they think wild and woolly and, grasslands and, not that typical pristine landscape. Well, there is some of that, but we can get past those cultural influences. And Townley, Doug Townley, he's an author, which I'll give you a website later, wrote an awesome book called Bringing Nature Home. He really speaks to how native plants are the basis of the food web. And the whole premise of his book is simply that our native insects, which are the start of the food web, have evolved to feed on our native plants. And therefore, if we have native plants, we have more food provided for birds, amphibians, lizards, snakes, foxes, skunks, opossums, you name it. The food web hinges around our native plants. And since many of we see wild spaces and we see our woodlands and we think, oh, well, native plants. Yes, there's a lot of native plants there, but there's also a lot of invasive plants there. There are almost no true native woodlands in the lower 48. It's almost unheard of. So and we are continually taking more and more of the land with urbanization and development. So it's up to us as gardeners to do our part, to take our little part of the world back and convert it as much as we can back to the use of native plants. Another challenge is limited availability. It's getting better, I will tell you that. It's the best it's been as long as I've been in the business, but it's still, some plants are still a challenge for me to get. But it's amazing how many native plants you can get, and it's amazing how many great native plants we already have that we're using, and there's different cultivars and varieties in the nursery trade available. The next thing is microclimates, the man-made environment. Some people have asked me, why don't you use all native on campus? That's really hard to do in a parking lot that might reach 110 or 15 degrees at high noon, when the native plants that evolved here, they're not used to that. They didn't evolve in those conditions where maybe the soil temperatures were off the charts because they were growing in a parking lot. So we do have some challenges, and for that reason, I don't see us going 100% native. I see us going more and more and more native, but still knowing that we might have to use crepe myrtle or some of these other Asian trees that can handle some of these parking lot conditions. It's a fact of life. We live in a very different environment than what some of these native plants evolved in. And another thing, we have very few local evergreen shrubs, and by local I mean native evergreen shrubs. If you think about it around here, any of you that have spent very much time in the outdoors, we essentially have a handful of evergreens. On occasion, if you happen to be on a cool, moist or east slope, you might find some mountain laurel down here and an occasional rhododendron. You might find a few things, but for the most part, we have no evergreen shrubs. We have a few evergreen trees, the red cedar, which is one of my favorite replacements for the Leyland cypress, which is overplanted. We have the American holly, which is another great evergreen tree. That's about it. We have some pines, but they don't fit that small stature. And our society, back to that cultural influence, we're really used to we love the 1 to 3 foot shrubs, in the evergreens, or maybe the 3 to 5s, just under your window height kind of thing. Most of those are plants from Asia or somewhere in Europe. Very few of them, grew here. So there are some limitations. I would say very few limitations, but there are some limitations. And then the next one is deer. And deer eat our non-natives as well. But with our native plants, a lot of the native plants are deer candy. You know, they've evolved with those plants, and they like them. So you have to be creative. Deterrents work, but if it rains, it washes them away. Sometimes we have to use some fencing. Dr. Weigel can attest to this. I know he has some fruit trees, and he has some deer. So I know a little bit about that. But that's just one of those things. Another really iconic and beautiful native tree is our redbud. This particular one, if you'll notice, it's a little bit more vibrant than the redbud you might think about. You think of sort of pale, washed out lavender. This one's called Appalachian Red. I love it. It's more fuchsia, really hot color, nice. There are a lot of great redbuds. There's a white redbud. There are redbuds with chartreuse foliage. There are redbuds with burgundy foliage or maroon, sort of like the Japanese maple that you might be familiar with. Lots of cultivars. There's some other North American natives like the Texas redbud and the Oklahoma redbud that we use that may not be natives in North Carolina, but in some of these hot spots, the Oklahoma makes more sense. And at least we're still using a North American native. Here's a combination of one of the redbuds I was talking about. This one has a really nice, the new growth is sort of this apricot color, and then when it's just a little, still young growth, it's got this nice chartreuse color that's darker on the inside. And these are the black-eyed Susans, both natives. This actually isn't a native, but could have been. If I had my time to do over, it probably would have been. That's been done a few years, but that's here on campus. This is at Bostwick Residence Hall, and this is a really nice sort of a case study where we had English ivy growing in a small area around a sign next to a bench there, this little triangle piece of land. And actually it was a lot of maintenance. If you can imagine trimming the English ivy around all these edges and around the bench and around the edge and then around the sign, it was a lot of maintenance and just wasn't much bang for the buck. We spent a lot of time maintaining, but it never really looked pretty. So we decided to go a different route and do something more interesting and use some all natives. And of course the sign has changed. The sign does help, I admit, but this is exactly the same spot, and that's a huge improvement. The coneflower, and this happens to be one called Powwow Wildberry, which is a more dwarf coneflower, and it's easier for us to use around the signage on campus. Some of the natives get up to about 4 feet, and although this is a native, it's a native cultivar. This is one of the switch grasses that has a nice burgundy red foliage in the fall. There's a little, or late summer, there's a little bit showing there. This is more of a dwarf form of the goldenrod, which is nice. But these have been really successful, and it was a simple thing to do. So don't be afraid to go native. Here's at Luda Residence Hall, a similar situation, slightly different planting. The yellow plant in the foreground is Coreopsis verticillata moonbeam. Great little plant, tough as nails, native, beautiful flowers. Here's a combination of natives and non-natives. You see the butterfly in the foreground. It's actually on a non-native lantana, which the lantana is one of our summer annual beds. But in the background there, you'll see a nice tall grass. That's one of the switch grasses. This site over at Alumni Hall, we've used a couple of different switch grasses, a taller one. This one's 5 to 6 feet in height. There's another that gets in the 2 to 3 foot range with the burgundy foliage. We've used it. So we've begun to sort of blend the natives with the non-natives, and they work quite well. And it's a way to slowly but surely introduce more natives into our landscapes. Making lemonade from lemons. campus expansion into the woods. If you've been around here the last few years, you've seen some trees cut down. We've built Byram, we've built the barn, the North Campus Dining and Residence Hall, and the waterfall field. Well, I could have been defeated by that, or I could, take another approach. And from what I know of my years' experience in the outdoors, edge areas can be really productive in a woodland. And by edge, I mean those spaces just on the outside of the woodlands, not in the dense forest where there's so much shade, but on the outside where there's lots of light and lots of diversity. There's a group of, there's forbs, there's perennials, there's all sorts of small shrubs and understory trees, and so there's a great opportunity. So that's what we've decided to do. We've taken those as opportunities, and we've reintroduced, we've gotten rid of invasives, and we've reintroduced many native plants that have been lost here from years of man's intrusion. And here's one of the examples. That's one of the switchgrasses over at Byram. A big majority of the plants over at Byram are native. This is the winter look, which I think is kind of nice. This is above Water Tower Field or Waterfall Field. We've just installed some loblolly pines, which ought to do quite well there. They give us a little bit of diversity, and they'll be a great area to underplant with dogwoods and redbuds, Appalachian, other natives. This is at the front of Byram. This is a native hydrangea. This cultivar is called Annabelle, readily available in the nurseries. Can take full sun or some shade. Blooms profusely in the summer. The deer do like it. They don't tend to bother these here right up against the building, which is nice because there's lots of deer over there. So sometimes it's placement in your landscape. This is just a close-up of that same plant, but they're beautiful in summer. And now there's actually a cultivar of this that grows in a pink, and the pink one is called Invincible Spirit. A percentage of your proceeds go to cancer awareness. I think it's for breast cancer maybe. So that's another little tidbit. Here's another one of my favorite, and this is some that we've introduced over at Byram. This is sassafras in bloom in spring. Nice little blooms there. And this is sassafras in summer with sort of the seed pods beginning to develop, the red seed pods. One of the interesting things on ID with this plant, you'll notice this is a single lobe leaf, and this is a double lobe, sort of like a mitt, and this is a three-lobed. One of the only trees I know of, or the only one I know of that grows that way. So it's a real easy identifier for that plant. Great native plant. When I was in Scouts, we used to make a tea out of it. Now we know that it causes cancer. I'm glad I didn't make many batches of tea. I think that was the original sarsaparilla or root beer was made from this, but I don't think they make it from that anymore. And this is Sassafras in fall. So it's really a multi-seasonal tree. Typically they're a small tree, 10 to 15 feet tall. We do have a few very large specimens, but really nice, beautiful fall color. This is Fothergilla over at the Welcome Center in one of the surrounding one of the bioretention cells. This is a close-up on Fothergilla. It's in full bloom right now. Beautiful plant, sweet fragrance, really nice native. This is at the barn. This row of plants here was to separate the trails from the circle out in front of the barn. These are American holly and red cedar. I mentioned before, those are two great native evergreens. It's a chance for us to introduce some natives back in a site where we lost some native trees. So we feel good about we're doing the right thing. Here's Appalachian. Some old-timers, locals would call it sarvis or serviceberry. This is in early spring. Can bloom quite profusely. Usually blooms a little bit before dogwood. This is at Byram, the Welcome Center. Here is the same plant in summer. This is actually in my yard at home, covered in fruit. Birds love it, and so do I. And this is a big colander full that I picked, and they didn't last long. They're really nice, tasty berry. So if you're interested in growing some fruit at home, Some years they fruit heavily, some years they don't, but it's a great, tasty little fruit. They're best when they're a little bit red. When they're really deep purple to black, they're a little flat, but it's a really nice plant. Get a little kick of vitamin C, and you can.
What's the official name of that again?
Appalachian, and there's a few different ones that are native, but Amelanchier, I think. But if you look it up online, it'll pop up. And there's some cultivars that are hybrids of some of the natives, so still it's a great plant. And they have a really nice fall foliage. It goes from yellow to orange to red. Nice plant. This is goldenrod. You'll notice a wasp perched atop. You'll never see a goldenrod in bloom, in daylight when you won't see all sorts of insects on it. It's a great plant. Winterberry holly, which is an awesome plant. You wouldn't think it's a holly, but it's a holly. They're just covered in red berries pretty much every winter. They are dioecious, so you need a male and a female. Normally one male will pollinate, multiple females just have it somewhere close by. But beautiful, beautiful plant. This is Henryehlers Rebecca, which is related to our black-eyed Susan. This Henryehlers is kind of an interesting story, and I kind of love these pinwheel-shaped flowers. They're kind of like little spoons on the end. This was found in a remnant stand in the Midwest along some of the railroad tracks. Some of those were the few spots that the land wasn't really developed. And this one cultivar just happened to, it just came up from seed. But it's a really neat plant, does well. This is a native viburnum that's in bloom right now. You might see it. It's Viburnum prunifolium. Prunifolium means the leaves look like a prunus or in the prune family. Those are not that easy to find, but there are a few native nurseries in North Carolina that do carry it. It's a neat plant. Grows 10 to 15 feet tall, kind of a sprawling small tree to large shrub. Interesting plant though, tough as nails. I like it. We've planted several on campus from small 1-gallon shrubs. These are some cultivars of the Redbud. This is the forest pansy I was talking about before. And this is Hearts of Gold. So you see how you can actually, with some of the cultivars that are available now, you can get creative in the landscape. This is actually at my home, and it's not a great slide, but I guess the story here is have fun and be creative. This is Oakleaf Hydrangea, which is one of my favorite native shrubs. This particular one's called Little Honey. It's hard to get. Wonderful, wonderful plant, though. You get this chartreuse foliage. I like to play it off of this really vibrant blue. That has a great fall foliage, too. The Oakleaf Hydrangea has anywhere from purple to red, so it's a wonderful plant. And this is, I like to say we were sustainable before it was popular. This is over at Graylen. This is a dry stream bed we did several years ago, and actually during heavy rain it flows heavily, but probably 90% or better of the plants in this landscape are native, and that was before natives were cool, so I feel pretty good about that. And it functions really well, and it's also beautiful. This is from Doug Townley. For the first time in history, gardening has taken on a role that transcends the needs of the gardener. Like it or not, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing to make a difference. In this case, the difference will be the future of biodiversity to native plants and animals of North America and the ecosystems that sustain them. Douglas Townley, Bringing Nature Home. The website is here at the bottom. If you'll research that website a little bit, you don't even have to buy the book. There's a good little blurb on there that really gets to the heart of the matter, and I think it'll encourage you to buy the book. But it gets to the heart of the matter about why we should be planting natives and why we need to spread the word to our friends and relatives and why I'm up here doing what I'm doing today. And Personally, I think as an institution of higher education, it's our duty to share this information, and that's why I encourage you to do that. Questions?